Hello again, I'm Michael Mountain, and in previous videos in this series we've looked at why we humans feel the need to tell ourselves that I am not an animal, and how we try to persuade ourselves that it's true. Let's take a look now at how and when this may have happened, and we can get some idea of how our ancestors saw their relationship with their fellow animals by looking at some of their earliest art and mythology and how it changed over the millennia. This is the cave at Chauvet in southern France, which has some of the most amazing artwork ever painted, most of it dating back at least 30,000 years. Back then, the artists didn't have carefully placed lighting and walkways like you see in this photo. It was a dark, frightening place, where you'd have painted by the light of maybe just a single flaming torch. And what those remarkable people painted were scenes of the animals who lived around them: horses, cows and bulls, lions, panthers, bears, hyenas and owls. Let's just look at them quietly for a few moments. What these paintings meant or signified to the people who painted them, we may never know. But we can say, just by looking at them, that even as the people who lived there were developing greater hunting skills and weapons, they had a level of respect for every animal, not just as a food source, but as an individual with whom the people felt intimately connected through the web of nature. Fast forward now 20,000 years to a period about 11,000 years ago, and to an archaeological site known as Gobekli Tepe, which is still being excavated in what is now Turkey. Gobekli Tepe predates the birth of agriculture and even the oldest pyramid in ancient Egypt, which wouldn't be built for more than another 5,000 years. This is what it would have looked like back in the day, and we can only guess what purpose it served. But the archaeologists there have also found lots of human skulls that appear to have been buried and then dug up, indicating perhaps a growing preoccupation with death, and suggesting that this is the world's oldest temple. One thing that stands out is the contrast in the portrayals of the humans and the other animals. The large-sized T-shaped pillars clearly represent humans, as you can see from the arms and hands in the right-hand photo. But the portrayal of the other animals, with their small size and low positioning, suggests a relationship that is no longer one of equality. Fast forward again, now to ancient Egypt several thousand years later, and you see a very different portrayal of our fellow animals. By now, they're increasingly stylized, no longer even portrayed as real living beings, but rather as symbols. The cow here as a mother figure. The dog as a god who judges people when they die, and the great cat goddess who brings good fortune. The crocodile as a symbol of the pharaoh's strength and military prowess, and the hippopotamus as a symbol of fertility. While the Egyptians viewed these animals as deities, these were deities who were being tamed. The pharaoh, and through him the people, saw themselves as becoming gods in their own right, as they sought to bring nature and the cycles of life and death under their control. And you don't have to be a great art critic to see the difference in these three periods of art. The vibrant life and energy of the animals in the cave painting 30,000 years ago, the static animals at Gobekli Tepe 20,000 years later, and the controlled, objectified, symbolic, essentially lifeless portrayals in Egypt 7,000 or 8,000 years later. So what happened over those thousands, those tens of thousands of years? Creation stories and mythologies from all around the world tell of a time way back when people lived in harmony with the rest of nature, and of a fall through which this benign relationship was torn apart by something about us humans that brought suffering and death into the world. The Cheyenne people speak of a time when humans were naked and innocent before they received a gift of knowledge that led to war, famine, and other disasters. According to ancient Mayan texts, humans began behaving as though they might become as gods. And there are African myths that describe a time when people understood the language of animals and lived at peace with them. At that time, according to the stories, the people also lived forever. Now, that is clearly not literally true, so perhaps the stories refer to a time when the fear of death was not an existential angst as it is today, and when our ancestors were living more in the present rather than being obsessed with the past and the future as we are today. Ancient Greek mythology tells of Prometheus coming down to earth to give humankind the gift of fire, representing enlightenment and self-awareness, and being punished by Zeus for doing that. The poet Aeschylus writes that Prometheus realizes later that the gift is actually a curse, because it has enabled people to foresee their own death. And as a result, they've developed great anxiety that's been affecting their behavior. So, to make up for this, Prometheus gives them a second gift, the gift of false hope, to enable them to go into denial over their mortality. Here's the text from Prometheus Bound, where he explains how he's tried to make up for giving humans the curse of being able to see their own future. Prometheus says, "I prevented mortals from foreseeing their death." The chorus, "By finding what remedy for this malady?" Prometheus, "I caused blind hopes to dwell within them." Chorus, "In this you gave a mighty benefit to mortals." But for me at least, the story of our descent into existential angst is best told in the biblical tale of the Garden of Eden. It's a dramatic picture of what happened as we humans developed greater self-awareness. The man and woman are, at first, naked and untouched by shame, living in harmony with the animals around them. Then they hear two voices, one warning them not to eat of the tree of knowing good and bad, lest they be touched by death, and the other telling them that if they go forward and become self-aware, they will become as gods. Both voices, of course, are true. The growth of self-awareness brings with it the duality of a godlike self-awareness and the potential to create our own world, together with, on the other hand, the painful, ungodlike, shameful awareness of our animal nature as naked, sexual, physical beings who are doomed to die. As Ernest Becker put it in his book The Denial of Death, we discover that we are gods with anuses. So catastrophic is this fall from innocence that within a few brief generations, according to the story of Noah and the flood, humankind has brought about the near destruction of the entire planet. And those two voices from the Garden of Eden still echo down through time, one telling us that more human progress will free us from the fear of death and even make us into gods, the other warning us to go back, even though it's just to some hopelessly distorted version of our lost innocence. It all plays out in the endless dualities of our competing political systems, our competing religions and belief systems, our ethnic conflicts, and our economic and global systems. But there's no going back to the innocence of an earlier time any more than we can go back to the innocence of our own childhood. And as for going forward, no amount of so-called progress has yet succeeded in freeing us from the existential angst of our own mortality. That's because either way, it's all just different ways of denying who and what we are, and the paradox of our own dual nature. Either way, then, we continue down the road of telling ourselves that we're not animals, that we're superior beings, somehow not subject to the laws of nature and mortality like the other animals, and that we can prove this by taking dominion over them. We tell ourselves that all creation exists for our exclusive benefit, and even these days that if we succeed in destroying planet Earth to the point where it's uninhabitable, which looks increasingly likely, we can just take off in spaceships and go somewhere else. But that's not going to happen. Instead, the only thing we're launching at the moment is a mass extinction of species that may end up including our own. So where do we go from here? That's what we'll look at in the next and final video in this series.